Hey guys, tonight we're taking a gentle stroll back in time, all the way to early modern Europe, to uncover the surprisingly quiet origins of something we all take for granted, the bedtime story. Imagine yourself, if you will, huddled by a flickering hearth, a scent of wood smoke thick in the air, as someone begins to speak in hushed tones, weaving a narrative thread that pulls you closer to slumber. No glowing screens, no earbuds, just the human voice and the rustle of straw. You might think, oh, how quaint, but honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week without your digital distractions. These folks lived by stories, not by Wi-Fi signals. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the printing press started churning out books like a medieval pastry chef making daily bread, stories were fluid, living things, passed from mouth to ear, often under the hush of twilight. You see, the concept of a bedtime story, as we know it, a specific, comforting narrative read aloud to a child before sleep, is actually a relatively recent invention in the grand tapestry of human history. For much of early modern Europe, say from the late 15th to the 18th century, the lines between daily entertainment, moral instruction, and pre-sleep ritual were far blurrier. You wouldn't have had a dedicated bedtime storybook. Instead, you'd be enveloped in a world where oral traditions reigned supreme, especially when the sun dipped below the horizon and the day's arduous labor finally ceased. Think about it. No electricity, no Netflix, no endless scroll. Once the candles were lit, or more often, once the fire provided the only illumination, people gathered. The oral tradition wasn't just about entertainment. It was the bedrock of cultural transmission. Grandparents, parents, or even a traveling storyteller might recount tales of local heroes, cautionary fables, or ancient myths. These weren't always gentle, mind you. Some tales, like certain European folktales that eventually made their way into the Grimm collection, were rather robust. They featured wolves, wicked stepmothers, and rather grim fates for those who strayed from the path. But even these, in the right voice, could have a hypnotic, lulling quality, the rhythm of the language itself a kind of comfort. You weren't necessarily being read a story. You were being told one, often with gestures and varying tones, making it an immersive, multi-sensory experience designed to hold attention. Yes, but also to bring the day to a close. Consider the role of the hearth in this era. It was more than just a source of heat. It was the nucleus of the home, a social hub once the light faded. Around it, families would gather, sharing not just warmth, but also narratives. These weren't always fictional. Often, they were accounts of the day's events, gossip from the market, or stories passed down from a previous generation about family ancestors or local historical occurrences. Imagine your great-grandparent recounting a story about a particularly stubborn ox, or a miraculous harvest, or even a strange encounter with a wandering peddler who claimed to have seen a talking raven. It's a far cry from Goodnight Moon, isn't it? Interestingly, while the concept of a children's book was still nascent, there were proto-bedtime stories emerging. Ballads, for instance, were a popular form of narrative, often sung or recited. You'd hear tales of chivalry, tragic love, or even comical misadventures, all delivered in a rhythmic, sometimes melancholic, cadence that could easily send a drowsy listener off to dreamland. These were often long, allowing for the slow unwinding of a narrative as the hours wore on. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these long recitations was to educate, entertain, or simply to fill the quiet hours before sleep descended. Perhaps it was all three, a gentle blend designed to settle the mind and body after a day of demanding physical labor. You might even recall how we spoke of crocodile dung sunscreen in ancient Egypt. Well, these stories, while less aromatic, served a similar purpose of making the mundane aspects of life a little more palatable, a little more magical. As the early modern period eased into itself, a quiet revolution was indeed stirring, not with thunderous shouts, but with the subtle rustle of paper, the printing press. While Gutenberg's invention had been around for a while, its impact on everyday life, and especially on bedtime habits, was a slow burn, not an explosion. For centuries, books were precious, hand-copied luxuries, largely confined to monasteries, universities, and the very wealthiest households. Imagine trying to fall asleep with a priceless, illuminated manuscript balanced precariously on your chest. You'd be more worried about damaging it than drifting off. But as printing technology matured and the cost of paper and production slowly, incrementally dropped, a trickle of printed material began to find its way into more modest homes. Now, we're not talking about Amazon Prime delivery here, or even your local bookstore. Access was still incredibly limited for the vast majority of the population. Illiteracy was widespread, especially in rural areas, so simply owning a book didn't mean you could read it yourself. This is where the enduring power of the oral tradition, which we just discussed, dovetailed with the nascent printed word. Often, if a family acquired a printed text, perhaps a Bible, a collection of sermons, or a popular almanac, the person who could read would do so aloud. This wasn't just for entertainment. It was often a communal act of learning, devotion, or simply a way to share information that was now, for the first time, fixed on a page. So, while you might not have been reading to yourself in bed, you might have been listening to your father or grandmother slowly, perhaps painstakingly, deciphering the printed words by the dim light of a rush candle. The very nature of stories began to subtly shift with print. Oral tales, remember, are mutable. They adapt, they change with each retelling, absorbing new details, shedding old ones, like a river carving new paths. But a printed story? It's fixed. The words are set. This allowed for the standardization of narratives, giving rise to canonical versions of popular tales. Think about it. Once Aesop's fables or certain saints' lives were printed and widely distributed, they started to solidify into the versions we recognize today. This meant that the stories you heard at bedtime in one village might be remarkably similar to those heard in another, hundreds of miles away, something almost impossible in a purely oral culture. Historians still argue whether this standardization enhanced the storytelling experience by preserving tales, or if it diminished the creativity and adaptability that characterized oral traditions. Perhaps it's a bit of both, like having a favorite recipe finally written down, preserving it, but also losing the little improvisations that made each meal unique. One fascinating byproduct of this printing revolution was the emergence of broadsides and chapbooks. These were the precursors to modern paperbacks and magazines, cheap, often crudely printed, single sheets or small booklets. They sold for a penny or two, making them accessible to a wider demographic, even if it meant saving up for a week. Broadsides often contained news, ballads, or moral warnings, meant to be read aloud in public squares or tacked to tavern walls. Chapbooks, on the other hand, were little bundles of stories, simplified versions of chivalric romances, lies of highwaymen, humorous anecdotes, or religious tracts. You wouldn't find them next to your pillow, but you might find them tucked into a pocket, to be brought out during quiet moments, perhaps even as the day wound down and the family gathered. Consider the flickering light, the rough texture of the paper, the smell of cheap ink. Reading by candlelight was no easy feat, often straining the eyes, so it was a slow, deliberate act. This wasn't about speed reading. It was about immersion. You'd carefully follow each line, perhaps tracing the words with a finger, letting the narrative unfold at a pace dictated by the dim light and the nascent skill of the reader. This slow, deliberate engagement with text, even if it wasn't specifically for sleep, cultivated a kind of meditative focus that could certainly lead to drowsiness. It was a stark contrast to the rapid-fire information we consume today. You'd certainly appreciate the simple, steady glow of a single candle after a long day in the fields, unlike the modern equivalent of scrolling on a phone, which seems to wake us up rather than winding us down. And speaking of winding down, remember how we talked about those Viking farmers? They probably didn't have chapbooks, but they definitely had long, dark nights to fill with stories. With the slow, steady churn of printing presses and the growing hunger for stories beyond the purely oral, something truly fascinating began to emerge. Chapbooks and penny dreadfuls. These weren't the weighty tomes of scholars or the revered Bibles. These were the pulp fiction of early modern Europe, designed to be cheap, accessible, and utterly captivating. Imagine a tiny, flimsy booklet, perhaps no bigger than your palm, filled with tales of adventure, romance, and sometimes a dash of the supernatural. These were the true ancestors of your modern paperback thrillers, bought not for intellectual pursuit, but for pure, unadulterated escapism. Chapbooks, named for the chapmen or peddlers who sold them, proliferated across the continent from the 16th century onward. These were often illustrated with crude woodcuts, adding to their rustic charm. You'd find them at markets, fairs, and even knocked door to door by traveling vendors. For a penny or two, you could acquire a story that might transport you to a faraway land, introduce you to a brave knight, or simply make you chuckle with a silly jest. They weren't exactly high literature, but they served a vital purpose, bringing narratives to the masses in a way that had never been possible before. Think of them as the social media feed of their day, but instead of endless scrolling, you get a neatly packaged, digestible story. Now, while they weren't exclusively bedtime stories in the modern sense, their very nature lent themselves to quiet, reflective moments, particularly as the day wound down. Many chapbooks contained simplified versions of classic folktales, ballads, or even abridged historical accounts. Imagine a farmhand, after a long day in the fields, settling down by a meager fire, carefully unfolding a chapbook to read about Jack the Giant Killer or the exploits of Robin Hood. The small size made them portable, perfect for a solitary moment before sleep claimed you. The stories themselves were often repetitive in their structure, relying on familiar tropes and simple moral lessons, which could be surprisingly soothing, like a gentle hum in the background of your mind. As we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, the penny dreadful emerged, particularly in Britain. These were slightly longer, more serialized versions of the chapbook, often focusing on crime, mystery, and sensationalism. While their name suggests something alarming, and indeed some were quite thrilling, they often featured dramatic cliffhangers designed to keep you coming back for the next installment. Picture yourself nestled under a rough blanket, the wind howling softly outside, completely engrossed in the latest escapades of a notorious highwayman or the dark secrets of a haunted manor. The mild thrill, perhaps, was just enough to engage the mind without truly unsettling it. Much like a cozy mystery novel today, historians still argue whether the content of these cheap publications corrupted impressionable minds or simply provided a much-needed escape from the harsh realities of daily life. It's a bit like the endless debate about violent video games today, isn't it? But one thing is clear. These humble publications democratized storytelling. They brought reading and the solace it could offer to people who would never have set foot in a grand library. They fostered a new kind of literacy, one driven by entertainment and curiosity rather than purely religious or scholarly pursuits. And for many, the act of following these simple narratives, whether read aloud by a literate family member or quietly to oneself, became a gentle ritual, a pathway to dreams. It is a far cry from the complex scientific treatises or theological debates that dominated earlier printed works, and a clear step towards the comforting, predictable narratives we now associate with bedtime. Even with the rise of chapbooks and the increasing availability of printed material, the fireside tale and communal reading remained a powerful, enduring force in early modern European homes. You might imagine that once books became more common, everyone retreated to their own corners, absorbed in solitary reading. But that wasn't quite the case. For most families, especially in rural areas, light sources were precious commodities. A single candle, a rushlight, or the glowing embers of a hearth were often the only illumination available after sunset. Gathering around that central source of warmth and light was not just practical. It was deeply ingrained in the social fabric. So even if a family owned a precious, albeit humble, book, perhaps a collection of fables or a travelogue, the chances are it would be read aloud. This communal act transformed reading from a solitary pursuit into a shared experience. Imagine the scene. You, your siblings, parents, perhaps even grandparents, all huddled together, listening to the slow, deliberate voice of the reader. The storyteller might pause to explain a difficult word, or to emphasize a particularly dramatic moment, drawing everyone deeper into the narrative. This wasn't just about absorbing the story. It was about bonding, about sharing a quiet moment of collective imagination after a long day of toil. It's a bit like modern podcast listening, but with much more direct interaction and the comforting crackle of a real fire instead of just a digital hum. These shared reading sessions often involve texts that we might not immediately associate with bedtime stories today. For instance, religious texts, like the Bible or collections of saints' lives, were commonly read aloud. While perhaps not humorous in the modern sense, the familiar rhythms of biblical passages or the reassuring narrative arcs of pious lives could be deeply calming. Think of the repetitive nature of psalms or parables, a gentle, almost hypnotic quality that could certainly lull a weary listener towards sleep. Historians still debate the extent to which these religious readings were primarily for moral instruction versus providing a comforting end to the day. Perhaps, like a good cup of chamomile tea, they served multiple purposes. But it wasn't all solemn prose. Alongside the religious texts, there were often printed collections of folk tales and legends that had once been purely oral. These printed versions, while standardizing the tales, also ensured their survival and wider dissemination. Imagine hearing a story about cunning animals, mischievous fairies, or even local mythical creatures. These stories, whether read from a printed page or recounted from memory, continued to play a vital role in passing down cultural knowledge. And values, often wrapped in a package of gentle humor or whimsical adventure. It is easy to picture a parent using a slightly exaggerated voice for the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, or a conspiratorial whisper for a ghost story, making the familiar tale even more engaging. This communal storytelling by firelight also provided a subtle form of education. For children, it was often their first exposure to literacy, even if they couldn't read themselves. They would connect the sounds of the words with the shapes on the page, slowly building an understanding of how stories were constructed. For adults, it was a way to stay connected to narratives that reinforced community values, or simply to escape the harsh realities of their daily lives for a little while. You might recall our conversation about the Incas domesticating forgotten fruits. Similarly, these families were domesticating stories, making them central to their lives, and weaving them into the very fabric of their evenings, a quiet counterpoint to the busy, demanding world outside their humble dwelling. As early modern Europe gently nudged its way into the later parts of the period and beyond, something rather profound began to happen. The act of reading, and consequently, the bedtime story, started its slow but steady shift towards solitude and personal comfort. No longer was it exclusively a communal affair by the flickering hearth. Increasingly, it became a quiet individual ritual, a personal journey into the world of words, often right before you drifted off to sleep. This evolution was driven by several factors. Firstly, literacy rates, while still not universal, continued their gradual upward climb. More people learned to read for themselves, spurred on by the proliferation of cheaper books and the growing need for literate individuals in burgeoning trades and professions. you no longer needed someone else to read to you. You could embark on your own literary adventures. Secondly, lighting technology, though still primitive by today's standards, saw small improvements. The advent of slightly better candles, and later, the dim glow of early oil lamps, meant you could potentially read in your own private space, away from the main family gathering. Imagine yourself with a tiny, precious lamp, casting just enough light to illuminate the page of a well-worn book, the world outside fading into soft shadows. It's a quiet rebellion, isn't it? Choosing your own story, at your own pace. As the day gently recedes, the content of these nascent bedtime stories also began to diversify. While moral tales and religious narratives still held sway, there was a growing appetite for purely entertaining fiction. This included early novels, often serialized, which allowed for a more sustained engagement with characters and plot lines. You might find yourself settling in with a volume of adventures, perhaps an early form of a travel narrative or a romantic tale, allowing your mind to wander through exotic landscapes or follow the trials of star-crossed lovers. These were stories not just for passing the time, but for truly immersing yourself, a gentle mental escape before the realm of dreams took over. Historians still argue about the precise moment when reading for pleasure truly took precedence over reading for instruction, but it's clear that this period marked a significant turning point towards personal leisure reading. The rise of dedicated children's literature was also a crucial development in this shift. While rudimentary moral tales for children had existed, the early modern period saw the slow emergence of books specifically designed to entertain and educate young minds. Think of early versions of fairy tales, simplified for a child's understanding, or collections of rhymes and verses. These were often read to children, establishing that comforting ritual of a parent or guardian sharing a story as part of the winding down process. But as children themselves learned to read, these books became their own quiet companions, fostering a love for reading that often extended into adulthood. The simple act of holding a book, turning its pages, and following the narrative was a deeply personal, soothing experience. It's a far cry from trying to get your own kids to put down their tablets, isn't it? So, while the roaring fire and communal voices didn't vanish overnight, the gentle glow of a personal lamp and the silent turning of pages slowly carved out a new space for the bedtime story. It became a more intimate affair, a moment of solitude where the day's worries could be shed and the imagination could take flight, guided by the words on the page. This quiet, personal act of reading before sleep laid the groundwork for the bedtime ritual that many of us cherish even today. A silent invitation to let your thoughts drift away with the story, a soft transition from wakefulness to slumber. Remember how we talked about Victorian insomnia cures? Perhaps the quiet contemplation of a story, chosen specifically for its calming effect, was one of the earliest and most effective remedies. And now, as the last echoes of those early modern stories fade, you can feel the quiet peace settling around you. The crackle of imaginary hearths is softened to a gentle whisper, the rustle of ancient paper, a calming murmur. Imagine the slow, steady rhythm of those voices, telling tales not of urgency, but of enduring human experience. Let the faint scent of old parchment and the subtle glow of a single candle fill your senses. Your own eyelids might feel a little heavier now, your breathing a little slower. The worries of your day, like the ink on a long-read page, are beginning to blur. There's nothing left to do but surrender to the quiet, the stillness, and the timeless comfort of a story told just for you as the world outside fades into dreams. Just relax. You're safe here, just letting go.